Hello folks, my name is Scott with Soul Reflections. I want to talk about the process and how we actually clean our vehicles. Now I know some of you might be saying, oh my god, I don't want to sit through a video on how to wash my car. I already know how to do that. I know how to break out a garden hose or my power washer or my wash mitt and actually wash my vehicle. And I'll agree with you, most of us know how to do that, so I'm not going to bore you with how to wash a vehicle. But if we actually look at the washing process and what we're actually doing, it's an important process, or an important part of the process of cleaning our vehicle. What we're actually doing is removing the unbonded contaminants from the paint when we actually break out the garden hose or the power washer and remove that dirt and grime off the car. What I mean by unbonded contaminants is basically light dust and dirt, traffic film, grease and grime that has the potential of falling on the paint, but it doesn't bond to the surface of the paint, so typically it will come off during the washing process. Now, there's a second part to cleaning our vehicles, and not a lot of people are aware of it, although the clay bar, which I'm actually holding in my hand, has been around for quite a bit of time, for over 20 years. But what this actually does, and if we look at the process of washing or cleaning our vehicle, after you've washed your vehicle and you've dried it, you might want to take your hand and gently glide it across the surface of the paint. What many of you may actually feel is you might feel some texture on the paint. You might feel what feels a lot like dragging your fingers across sandpaper. And typically people will ask me, Scott, what is that that's still on the paint that didn't come off during the washing process? And in this video I'm going to attempt to try to explain what those contaminants are that are bonded to the paint and how do we remove them and why we would want to remove them. Now first, in my industry, these bonded contaminants that can be on the paint even after you wash the car, my industry calls them industrial fallout. Well, that's a big fancy word, and really basically what it means is unfortunately living on this planet. And what I mean by that, it's not unfortunate that we live on this beautiful planet, but it's unfortunate that there's a lot of pollution that floats in the air, and many of us are aware of these pollutions. In fact, they're making some of us sick as human beings, but they can also affect the car as well. And there's various different types of pollution that's floating around. And this pollution has the ability to be able to kind of drift and fall onto the paint of your vehicle and permanently bond itself to the car. Now the purpose of this video is going to be talking about this funny little thing I'm holding in my hand. It's this blue clay disc type of, it's actually called a clay bar. And that's what this video is going to be about, and how this clay bar actually assists us at truly cleaning the vehicle and removing those bonded contaminants from the paint. Now as I hold this thing in my hand, it kind of looks like Play-Doh. Maybe when you were a child you remember playing with Play-Doh, or maybe you have small children in the home now that are playing with Play-Doh at this present time. It looks a lot like that, although it's a little bit more stiffer. It's not as flexible as Play-Doh, but it has the same type of feel to it. The other thing that this clay bar actually is, or how it feels when I hold it in my hand, is that it's sticky. It's very tacky. And that's an important point that I wanted to bring up in this video. If you're like me and I watch YouTube videos on how the clay bar works, and I've been using this for a very long time, I've actually heard professional detailers and I've heard some car enthusiasts actually say, because the clay bar is sticky, it's tacky, that's what gives it the ability to be able to shear or pull the bonded contaminants off the paint. Well, unfortunately, that's not true. What this actually is, this clay bar is actually abrasive. It's a form of material that's actually abrasive. Now some of you, maybe the little light bulb went off in your head and you said, why in the world would Scott, who calls himself a professional detailer, use anything that's abrasive on the surface of the paint? Because that could potentially scratch the paint. Which is the first point I want to bring up here, is that yes, if somebody was to ask me, does a clay bar scratch the paint? The answer to that, the simple answer to that, the most honest answer to that is going to be yes, it does scratch the paint. Now we have to look at the level of scratching that a clay bar actually does on the surface of the paint to understand that a little bit more. The actual scratching that can potentially happen during the clay bar process is what we call micro scratches or micro marring. And typically, if you're using the clay bar correctly, the scratches that are left on the surface of the paint cannot be picked up with the human eye. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. In fact, we probably would have to use some type of microscope after I drag this clay bar across the paint to actually see some of those scratches. And like most things in life, there's pros and cons to just about everything. And there's multiple reasons why we want to get these bonded contaminants off the car, and the pros to removing the bonded contaminants, if you will, outweigh the minor risk of actually scratching the paint on a micro level. So we're going to discuss why we would actually use this clay bar to remove those contaminants and why we would actually want to do that. There's a couple of different ways to look at this. If you were standing at your kitchen sink or your bathroom sink and you were looking in the mirror, you would see your reflection back. If that mirror was absolutely clean and had no type of imperfections in the mirror, your reflection would be absolutely undistorted, extremely clear, and very crisp. Well, if you can imagine all these pollutants that are floating in the air and they land on the paint of your vehicle, the same effect kind of happens, kind of like looking in the mirror. If you had that same mirror that you were looking at in the bathroom and it was slightly dirty, or we took some type of transparent nail polish and smeared it all over the glass, and then we looked at ourselves in the glass, yes, you would still see your reflection, but most of you will agree with me that that reflection would be slightly distorted. It wouldn't be so clear, it wouldn't be so crisp. So what happens is, as these pollutants are floating through the air and they land on the paint, and then we wash our car and we dry our car, what can actually happen, the way our human eyes actually work and how it picks up and our eyes are able to have a reference to shine and gloss, the surface has to be completely flat, completely true, and it has to be free of any type of texture. When that happens, our human eyes see that panel of paint as shiny and glossy. So if you have all these contaminants on the paint and you look at your paint in direct sunlight, it will actually diminish the paint's ability to give you the shine and gloss that you're looking for. Now I say that carefully because if you have a car that's incredibly scratched up and you clay bar it, that doesn't mean it's going to take it from a level 2, let's say, to a level 10, meaning 10 being maximum shine and gloss. But the clay bar does have the ability to be able to restore some shine and gloss because we're actually removing that texture from the paint. Now the other thing that the clay bar, or the other reason why we would use the clay bar, and as a professional detailer, and I watch a lot of YouTube videos as well, I don't see this point really being discussed all that much, but it's an important point to bring up in this video. The reason why we would want to remove these bonded contaminants after we've washed our vehicle is because most likely most of us are going to go grab our favorite wax or paint sealant off the shelf in the garage and then apply it to the car. And this is an important point I want to make in this video. If you can imagine for a moment a talented artist who was about ready to create a masterpiece and was sitting in front of a canvas, if the canvas was already dirty, typically the artist is going to look at the canvas and go, I'm not going to create a masterpiece on this dirty canvas. The same applies for these bonded contaminants that are on the paint. We want to remove them and kind of have a perfect or beautiful canvas in which we could apply our wax and sealant to the car. And there's a reason for this. The waxes and sealants that we're buying, they were formulated and manufactured to be able to bond to an absolutely clean clear coat, which I actually call a virgin clear coat. What that means is there is no unbonded contaminants on the paint or bonded contaminants from the paint from any type of pollution that floats around in the air. Once you've removed all those contaminants from the paint and then you apply a wax and sealant to the car, what you're doing is actually assuring yourself that that wax or sealant of your choice has an absolutely great ability to be able to bond and cross-link to that paint, which would translate to more durability and longevity of that wax and sealant. Now, the other reason why we would want to remove these bonded contaminants before the paint is when we're doing some type of paint correction on the car. What paint correction actually is that a professional detailer would use a rotary buffer or a dual action polisher, and they would have some type of wool pad or foam pad attached to that polisher. And if you can imagine, if we hadn't removed the bonded contaminants from the paint, and I was here with a rotary buffer with a wool pad on it, let's say, what I'd actually do is I would pull those contaminants off the surface of the paint, and they would stick and lodge to the bottom side or the surface of the wool pad. And what I would actually be doing is grinding, I would be grinding those contaminants back into the paint. And after all, when we're doing some type of paint correction, we're trying to remove scratches, not put scratches in the paint. And the way this clay bar actually works, I'm going to illustrate it here on this vehicle that I have in front of me, and to kind of help you guys understand exactly how a clay bar works and some of the components that are needed to make this thing work effectively. Most of us have to shave. As a man, I typically shave my face, or if you're bald like me, you'll shave your head. Or if you're a woman, you're typically shaving your legs. Now, most of us are going to use a razor during that process to be able to shear off the hair follicles from our skin. That's kind of like the clay bar. That's exactly what it's trying to do. When I glide it across the surface of the paint, it's shearing or pulling off those contaminants off the paint. So it's a lot like the razor during the shaving process. Now, most of us, before we even begin to shave or apply the razor to our face, we're going to put some type of lubricant on our face in the form of shaving cream or soapy water, because most of us know if we didn't do that, most likely we would just scratch our face during the process of shaving. So it's important to have the surface lubricated. Now, when it comes to claying the vehicle, we also want to lubricate the surface as well. And we would use some type of dedicated clay lube, or maybe a detail spray that's highly has a high factor of lubricity, and it's extremely has the ability to lubricate the panel, so it becomes a safe process of removing those bonded contaminants with the use of the clay bar. And it would look a lot like this. What I have in my hand, of course, is the clay bar, and then I have I have a dedicated detail spray. This actually happens to be made by Meguiar's. It's from their professional line of products, and it's called Last Touch Spray Detailer. But this stuff is incredible. Not only can you use it as a detail spray, but you can also dilute it appropriately and make a really effective clay lubricant. And the way this works is you would typically spray the panel down, and as I spray this panel down, it reminds me of a key point. When you're lubricating the panel and using a clay lube, you kind of want to be a little aggressive with this. You can be liberal with it. The more clay lubricant, in my opinion, on the surface of the panel will lessen the risk of the clay bar actually scratching the paint. So you can go crazy with it if you want. What I'm trying to say is don't spray one little spray on the panel and think that's going to give you enough lubrication to be able to do the clay bar surface. That just won't work, and you could potentially scratch the paint. So we're going to go ahead and just put some clay lubricant on the surface of the panel, and then I'm going to put this clay bar in the area that I sprayed the clay lubricant, and I'm going to glide it back and forth over the surface of the paint. And typically when people see me doing this, they'll ask me, "Hey Scott, that's pretty cool. I get it. I understand that it pulls those contaminants off the paint, but how much pressure are you applying when you're actually running the clay bar?" And that's a great question. And the best way to answer that is the amount of pressure going to apply to the clay bar during the clay bar service is going to depend on how much contamination you have on the paint. So let's say you have a light layer of contamination, then only light pressure is actually needed. If you have a heavy layer, or I would say more of a medium level or moderate level of contamination on the paint, you'll go ahead and apply medium pressure. And I know for most of us watching this video, light pressure, medium pressure can mean different things to each individual, but something very interesting happens when you use the clay bar. It's very intuitive once you start using it. The contamination will actually tell you how much pressure is needed. Now with that said, I don't want anybody to feel like they have to have level 10 pressure, 30 pounds of pressure, where the panel's actually flexing or possibly could bend. Typically, light to medium pressure is all that's required to remove those contaminants from the paint. Now, as I slide this back and forth over this panel, what typically will happen, if there happens to be any type of contamination on the paint, I'll feel some resistance when I initially start to use the clay bar, because I'm actually feeling the clay bar kind of traveling through those bonded contaminants and shearing it and pulling it off the surface of the paint. Then what will happen, as those contaminants get sheared off and they get pulled off the paint, the clay bar will get really easy to travel in this area, and it will get silky smooth, and it will be really easy to move it back and forth. When that happens, that's the indicator to you that you've removed all the contaminants from that area and it's time to move on. The reason I bring this point up is I notice a lot of people that clay their vehicles, they'll actually clay their vehicles like they're washing their dishes in the kitchen sink. They'll actually be scrubbing the paint. That's not necessarily needed. You just want to apply some light pressure, just enough pressure to engage the clay bar into the contaminant so we can pull it off the vehicle. And you'll notice it right away once that resistance goes away and it gets really easy to move that clay bar across the surface of the paint. That tells you to stop and say, I'm done, I can move on to another area of the car or work in another 2x2 area. Now, the other question I get when it comes to claying is, Scott, how often can I clay my vehicle? And that's a great question as well. And usually I answer that question by giving a question back to that individual, and I'm not trying to be arrogant or be a jerk when I do that, but I think it's a great way to kind of illustrate and explain to somebody. Typically what I'll ask is, how often do you go to the doctor? Well, the biggest response I typically get is people go, I only go to the doctor when I don't feel well. And that's the case when it comes to taking these bonded contaminants off the paint. You want to check your paint from time to time. Let's say today we removed all these contaminants from the paint. We might want to check it maybe once every 2 months just to see if there's any contaminants on the paint. If we can begin to feel some of those contaminants reappearing because pollution is prevalent and it's always there and it's going to come back to the paint at some level at some time, then you would take your clay bar and remove those contaminants once again if the paint actually felt bad. Now, the reason I bring this point up is because probably a lot like you, I watch YouTube videos about the auto detailing process, and I watch videos about the clay bar. I've actually heard some professionals actually encourage those who are watching their videos to clay bar their car once a month. And I think why they do that is they're trying to help the customer be proactive, or the one watching the video to be proactive, and that would kind of make sense logically. It's like, hey, I want to be proactive and I want to remove those contaminants before they can permanently bond to the paint. But there's something we have to remember, that this clay bar is an abrasive form of material. And I can promise you that if you were choosing to clay bar your vehicle once a month, that probably over a 12-month period, at the end of the year, you're probably going to see some of those fine scratches and marring that can happen during the claying process. So typically the best answer when somebody asks me, how often should I clay my car? The best answer is, feel the paint from time to time. If you feel any type of contamination, then you're good to go. You can go ahead and use the clay bar. But doing it once a month just to be proactive, in my opinion, is just a little too aggressive. Well, I hope in some way this has been able to help you understand what the clay bar is, how we use it, and why we use it. Now, the other issue I want to bring up about the clay bar is it's incredibly effective at being able to remove contaminants off the paint. But you can use it in other areas on the vehicle as well. You can use it on the glass. You can basically use it on any hard painted surface or any hard surface that's not textured on your car, even some types of metal or even some type of trim, as long as that trim is not made out of plastic or rubber and it has some type of texture to it. If you actually ran this clay bar over a form of material that had texture on it, it would just rip the clay bar apart. It wouldn't be all that effective. So as long as the surface is absolutely smooth and hard, like the paint on your car or like the glass on your vehicle, this is a great way to be able to remove those contaminants, because we've got to remember these contaminants or these pollutants that are in the air won't only affect the paint, they'll also affect the glass and some area around the car as well, like this chrome trim. You can actually use it on the chrome trim as well. Now when you're using this clay bar and you're gliding it across the surface of the paint and you're working in a 2x2 area, what the clay bar is doing, as we've mentioned in this video, it's shearing off those contaminants. And because the clay bar is sticky, it's tacky, those contaminants are going to stick to the bottom of the clay bar. They actually will embed themselves within the clay, and that's okay. That's how the process works. But what you want to do is when you're working in a 2x2 area, you kind of want to monitor or keep an eye on the bottom of this pad, and this is where common sense comes into play. Once this pad or this clay bar begins to look a little contaminated, you want to actually knead it back into itself, and you can twist it and turn it, and then you can smash it back into a small little disc patty that can fit in the palm of your hand. And the process of kneading it, what you're doing is you're revealing a new layer of clay, and then you're ready to go on to the next section of the car. So again, I hope this helps you understand exactly what the clay bar is, how it's used, and why it's used. And something to keep in mind as well, if you have any questions about the clay bar, and I know this, I'm trying to keep this video as short as I can, and the clay barring process and the how to use this clay can be an awfully extensive conversation. But if you have any questions at all about the clay bar or how to use it, or you want some more in-depth knowledge about it, if you actually look below the link of this video and you look in the description box, I'll have my websites listed. I actually own two companies here in the Dallas area. One's called DallasPaintCorrection.com, and the other one's called TexOmaAutoDetailing.com, which is just north of the Dallas area. If you go to those websites, there's a phone number on each and every one of those websites. You are more than welcome to call me and ask me any questions at all about the clay bar and how you're going to use it on your vehicle. I welcome those calls all the time. It's absolutely fine. Or if you're looking for somebody to detail your vehicle and use a clay bar on your vehicle to remove those bonded contaminants, you can look at my services and you'll see that just about every auto detailing package I offer, I actually offer a clay bar service within those packages, because I absolutely believe in this product. When it's used appropriately, it really does help restore some level of shine and gloss, and it will leave the surface of your paint absolutely silky smooth. And so, as a professional detailer, I absolutely believe this is a must, especially on a car that needs to be detailed and hasn't had a clay bar service in quite some time. Those bonded contaminants want to come off the car. So typically I offer it in every package that I offer when it comes to the packages of the detailing process that I can do for your vehicle. So if you go to my website, whether it's DallasPaintCorrection.com or TexOmaAutoDetailing.com, if you have any questions, my phone number is listed there. You'll notice my packages that are on it. I'm doing a clay bar service in just about every one of those packages. And again, I hope this has helped you understand how this little blue little disc, this silly little disc, but that's incredibly effective, actually does clean the vehicle even after washing the car. So thank you so much for sitting through this video. I know it's a little bit long, and so I give you a thumbs up if you've sat through it, and I can't thank you enough, and I appreciate your time. And until the next time, be safe.